Welcome to the chaos sector. We're not focusing on the trial right now because it's clearly going nowhere until evidence is presented in trial. We will wait till the trial begins, evidence presented, and we will definitely break that down. Let's go back to the timeline before everything happened, because there is clearly misdirection. We can never know the exact setting at the home, despite what has been reported. We don't even know if Kaylee and Maddie even made it back to the home, to be honest. We don't know if Ethan and Xana ever made it back. We're just assuming they did. It seems likely they did, so that's what we've always drawn theories from. I say this because it was never confirmed which set of victims were attacked first. We assume Ethan and Xana were first because they're on the second floor and Kaylee and Maddie on the third. But if Maddie had spilled the beans, it gives the indication that the third floor was targeted first. Another oddity about News Nation, they claim that Gonzalez made calls from 2:30 a.m. to 3 a.m. to ex-boyfriend Jake Schreiger. Don't you mean Jack Decour? I don't recall any reports claiming Jake, who was Maddie's boyfriend, by the way. I don't recall any reports of Jake being called that night. Now pay attention, this exact time frame from 2:30 a.m. to 3 a.m. is the same time frame the mainstream media and authorities reported that it was Jack Decour who was being called. Where is Jake coming from? Furthermore, if you have Jake's name, this means someone gave you the boyfriend or ex-boyfriend of Maddie, right? So how does this happen? That so-called updated article from News Nation was published December 30th, 2022, ironically the same day that Koberger was arrested. Many may not make a big deal about this and claim it's information that got misinterpreted or names got mixed up. The problem is, those names don't get mixed up. They're not similar, especially the last name. How do you get Decour and Schreiger mixed up? You don't. In addition, this is the boyfriend of Maddie on top of that. In this article, there is no mention of Jack Decour, yet wasn't he the one who was called during that time frame? Again, another oddity. See, these are things we break down. What I can conclude from this is it was Jack Showalter who was called, and they couldn't get in touch with Showalter and then called Jake. Showalter is best friends with Jake, and Maddie had called Showalter first because, apparently, he stayed down the street, couldn't get in touch with him for obvious reasons we explained, and then Jake was called. Not sure when the report of Jack Decour being called was published, but it doesn't matter from this perspective. But it does matter in the perspective that they tried to make it the ex-boyfriend instead of Showalter, who had previously warned the girls about obviously a danger. They made it the ex, and claimed it was, quote, late-night power calling, starting to think they never actually made any of those calls. Since the perpetrators framed one of the victims in ordering some fucking food with DoorDash, it's also logical those phone calls were just made to make it appear they were alive. We also presented that as a possibility in the first series. If anyone remembers in our simulation series, we addressed how Jack Decour was reported as being like 26 in an article but 22 in another one, and some claimed, no, Jack is 22. He went to such and such high school. It's public information on it. But how could his age get confused like that then? Where did the individual who knew Jack was the ex-boyfriend, knew that the couple was together for 5 years, also get the age of Jack wrong in claiming he was 26? Do you think they got wrong information? Well, they got all the other information right regarding Jack, right? I believe Jack was 26 at that time. And of course we broke that down. He was 21 and Kaylee was 16. The parents of both find out at some point and decided to let them date as long as Jack respected Kaylee. We went on to link a motive, of course, that Jack was devastated that Kaylee had decided to move on and didn't want to let her go. Being with Kaylee from 21 to 26 years old, Jack had basically saw her as his future wife. Maybe Kaylee thought that at one point in the relationship, but things changed. Family members from both sides even suggested that they were planning on getting back together. Says who? Because Kaylee had moved out of that house, moved out of town, and was pursuing a career in another state, thousands of miles away. Didn't seem like Kaylee had plans on getting back together. Comes back to Moscow and wasn't allowed to leave ever again. Kaylee had realized the dangers and decided to leave. I would have assumed that Maddie would want to relocate as well, to be with her best friend. Start families together, you know. But it appeared she didn't have plans on leaving. Maybe she did. Who knows? The point to all of this is those housemates were targeted. The victims were the targets. It wasn't a random massacre. The house wasn't the target, as Moscow PD presented as a possibility, it was specifically those housemates. And of course, the obvious problem further in this article. The surviving housemates woke up and discovered one of their housemates on the second floor, unresponsive and call friends over. Unresponsive is a very vague statement and obviously a wait for it term used for damage control. Because guess what Moscow PD described the scene as? They discovered a bloody and gruesome scene at the home. I guess the so-called surviving housemates were blindfolded and had aroma patches covering their noses. Yeah, get the entire fuck out of here. But interesting though, one of the housemates unresponsive on the second floor, Dylan coming around the corner, would see this housemate on the second floor. And that would be Ethan, laying in the hallway. We all know they discovered the housemates deceased. But in this scenario, Dylan first spotted Ethan, quote, unresponsive on the floor, called friends over as she slowly approached the bedroom. And as she got closer, she saw all the blood pouring on the floor, then seeing Xana laying deceased in the bedroom with blood pouring on the floor. The key element they will erase from this is the very fact that they knew the housemates were deceased. Before even approaching the body, you would suspect that Ethan had been harmed or even murdered. But, what do you expect with a cover-up? Guess Gray Hughes doesn't feel the need to recreate that scene in the home and present the animation to court TV. Oh, hell no. Hughes wouldn't dare present what actually occurred in that home. We have a few animators on the team, we might just do that. Here's the thing. The motive is the focus for us. It always has been. Ethan, Xana, Kaylee, and Maddie were the victims. Dylan and Bethany were spared. Yes, they were spared. Even in the narrative, it was the alleged Koberger. They were spared. If he had a target, then he decided to take out multiple people who were not the target. And we have to keep reiterating this. A K-bar knife is sharp and, of course, deadly. But in a physical engagement, the variables to that lone killer narrative are just too unpredictable. The only way a lone killer could accomplish this is either the victims were murdered in their sleep, such as having their throats slit, or fatal blows that incapacitate the victim from being able to put up a struggle against the lone killer. Or, well, you would have to have a very strong individual who could wield the knife without any complications due to the victims reaching and attempting to prevent being stabbed. We're not saying Koberger isn't a strong person, but I think Ethan is the determining factor to the lone killer narrative. Ethan was reported as being discovered in the hallway, and in another report, he was discovered in Xana's bed. We went over this, but again, for new audience members. If Ethan is discovered in Xana's bed without any signs of resistance, it is painting the narrative that he was murdered in his sleep or had suffered a fatal blow. If I'm not mistaken, the autopsy report didn't state that Ethan suffered a fatal blow, such as to his heart, neck, lungs, or any other vital organ. His wounds were described as, quote, sharp, blunt force. This blunt force, combined with Xana's physical struggle, indicates that in this scenario, both victims were being attacked within the same time frame, and that indicates there were multiple people. See if Ethan was awake and aware he is protecting his girl to the death. And if he isn't successful, at least he went down as a strong defense, which would also give Xana time to run away. That's what the protector wants his girl to do, if she can. Mind you, we stick with the scenario of Ethan being discovered in the hallway, not the bed, because that creates the setting where Ethan was murdered in his sleep. Okay, let's break that down. The so-called lone killer enters Xana's bedroom. She's awake, by the way. We went over this, but once again, Xana is awake. Based on their claim, she was waiting for her DoorDash and being on TikTok, right? So the killer enters the room. Immediately, Xana screams. Ethan is awakened. He sees the killer with a knife. And even if the killer proceeds to stab Ethan based on the same fight that Xana put up, what do you think happened in this scenario? You guessed it. Xana is going to fight in this scenario as well. So even though Ethan may have suffered some injuries, he more than likely hasn't suffered a fatal blow. Still, fighting for his life and his girlfriend, who is right by his side, presenting enough resistance that can possibly give them the upper hand. So this is why Ethan was alluded to being asleep when he was murdered, by claiming he was discovered in Xana's bed. Mind you, they never confirmed that any of those housemates were asleep. They alluded to it, which of course makes it more convincing that a lone killer could just walk into that home and murder 4 people. And another thing to that is it places the victims in those locations during the attacks as well, which obviously changes the time frame in which the murders would be successful, and also how the lone killer would be able to handle squirming housemates running around after being stabbed or aware of the danger in the home. In other words, there were multiple killers, and the housemates couldn't escape. Okay, fuckers, we're breaking your lies down one by one. Now, with these 4 being the victims, we break down what the motive would be and how each victim is connected to that motive. The drug-related motive would suggest that those 4 victims were involved in drug-related activity or associations that led to being targeted. Maddie spilled the beans to Adam. Kaylee wondered about it, so we can assume both girls were targeted based on this motive. Now, for Ethan and Xana, there isn't any proof that they were targeted related to that motive. It's possible, but maybe they were trying to help their peers and also were murdered? It's possible. Based on the Linda Lane audio, I think Ethan and Xana were in that alleyway before the attacks on Kaylee and Maddie had occurred. He was beaten severely, Xana and Ethan come back home, Kaylee and Maddie then call Jack about it, and soon after they're all murdered. You may say, wait, you're presenting conflicting scenarios all at once. What I'm doing is trying to zone in on specific time frames that will help determine when the attacks and murders occurred. Ethan's mother stated that 2 a.m. was a dark hour. Xana's father claimed that he spoke to her around 12 a.m., and apparently the couple was at home around that time eating pizza. Okay, let's try to sort all of this out. First, the 2 a.m. hour being dark is not based on the hour itself. Now, it is reported that Ethan and Xana arrived back around 1:45 a.m. Yet, in other reports, the mainstream media claimed Ethan and Xana's whereabouts were not known from 9 p.m. to 1:45 a.m. Now, how in the hell do you not know where they were between 9 p.m. and 1:45 a.m., but know they were somewhere at 9 p.m. and arrived back home at 1:45 a.m.? I'm not going to get into it right now. I know it's frustrating trying to weed all of this out. That's why we're doing it. Just hold on to that 9 p.m. to 1:45 a.m. time frame for a moment. We'll get back to it. Ethan's mother claims 2 a.m. was a dark hour, right? Why would she say this? Because she knew they got home around that time. I don't think so, my friends. She knew that Ethan had been in a fight around that time, as his siblings had called the parents about that fight. This would be within that 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. time frame we examined in the Linda Lane audio. We heard the name Ethan, the name Aiden, and even what sounded like someone being slammed against a vehicle. It was evident that Ethan was being beaten for whatever reason. Someone perhaps called his siblings, and then they called the parents. In our audio analysis of Linda Lane, the time frame in which Ethan's name was heard was approximately 2:20 a.m., but he would more than likely be there prior to us being aware of him being there based on his name being heard, you see? This aligns with the 1:45 a.m. alleged arrival back home. But they may have not actually gone home, rather went to the alleyway to, settle some type of score. Some claim that one of Ethan's so-called friends had challenged him to a fight, as he was actually jealous of Ethan, and it finally ended up resulting in a fight. It's possible because there were several males heard in that audio analysis. Several females were heard as well, and one assumed to be named Aiden had screamed out OMG, and the way that was stated, my friends, is her reacting to witnessing someone lying on the ground after being beaten, unconscious, or even deceased. We also tried to decipher a segment of her statements, which was either stating, you lied, or he died, and the male is saying, no, as he is noticing the female, Aiden, is showing signs she may reveal something and yells out her name, attempting to prevent her from announcing it to the neighborhood. So based on that analysis, we know that something had happened in which the male is trying to prevent the neighborhood from knowing, such as housemates from a specific home. I believe someone posted a comment saying that could be something totally unrelated to those housemates, such as typical college students drunk and even a couple having an argument, not with Ethan's name heard. This activity is related to or even centered around an individual named Ethan. Also in that Linda Lane audio analysis, we hear a female state quote, "Poor guy." She is observing this guy being beaten and felt bad for him. Other males are heard, and this is when what sounds like someone being slammed against a vehicle was heard. There is no confusion, misinterpretation. The female literally states "poor guy," and a male is heard yelling, and a sound effect of what sounds like someone being slammed against a vehicle was heard. This is evidence, my friends. We need to keep this at the forefront of the investigation. And this would be around 2:20 a.m. Ethan's mother states 2 a.m. is a dark hour. I mean, it's obvious who this was in that audio analysis. Okay, stop. Stop right there. All right, Xana's father claimed he spoke to her around 12 a.m., and the couple was physically at home during this time. So did they head off to the house for some, quote, alone time? Understandable, get away from the party, spend some quiet time together. But did they return to the party, or did they stay at home? Because based on the mainstream media's accounts, they weren't even at the Sigma Chi party, right? But in the affidavit, they are at the party from 10 p.m. to 1:45 a.m. Who in the hell is telling the truth here? It pains me to say this, but it's the mainstream media, because they would get that same time frame from the authorities. So why would the authorities also state they were at the party then? All right, let's dig deeper. The reason they said they were at the party when they weren't is because if they were at home, like Xana's father claims, well, they would be back before everyone else, including the mysterious or even suspicious Dylan. If they're at home, it's likely around 4 a.m. they would be asleep, instead of Xana ordering DoorDash and being on TikTok. That would have happened perhaps when everyone else arrived back home, approximately 2 a.m. By 4 a.m., Ethan and Xana would more than likely be asleep, due to being at home earlier for that span of time. You understand? So that's to justify the DoorDash and TikTok narrative. I think the other reason is when Dylan got home, there is something to her arrival back at home. Something tells me she wasn't alone. Maybe her boyfriend came back. Bonnie and Clyde were all there, and Ethan or Xana, or even both, were not too fond of Bonnie and Clyde. This may have led to an altercation. Clyde challenges Ethan to a fight. Ethan obliges, and they go outside and fight. Ethan is basically beaten up, and then Xana may have said something like, "I know what you guys do. I'll call the cops," and they came back and murdered Ethan and Xana. There is something to the misdirection of Ethan and Xana's whereabouts in the reports. That misdirection is linked to their deaths. Again, News Nation reported that Ethan and Xana's whereabouts were not known from 9 p.m. to 1:45 a.m. Where are they getting this information from, if not the authorities who contacted their peers, even those who attended the party? Of course, it would be a report from the authorities. But in the same breath, Bethany saw Ethan and Xana at the party from 10 p.m. to 1:45 a.m. We mentioned this. Bethany didn't quote, "See Ethan and Xana at the party from 10 p.m. to 1:45 a.m., because that would mean she, quote, saw them for close to 4 hours. You don't see someone for 4 hours, especially if you're fellow housemates. You're at the party with those housemates, regardless if you didn't arrive at the same time. You're more than likely going to leave together, or at least let each other know when you're leaving." And this is why they made it appear that nobody knew Ethan and Xana's whereabouts, because it creates a mystery to throw you off from the fact that Bethany was right along with them at the party. But you may say, how can they create the mystery if they report Bethany saw them at the party from 10 p.m. to 1:45 a.m.? It's to create confusion. Yeah, they worded it that way, to make it appear she wasn't actually attending the party, but, quote, stopped by and saw them at the party. In addition, with Bethany physically at the party, more than likely, this means they went to the party together that night. Remember, Bethany and Dylan were not together. Dylan's whereabouts, like fucking Where's Waldo, her whereabouts were intentionally left out. She could have been anywhere, and may have even still been at home, while everyone else had gone out. Pretended to head out, then came back home, setting up the plot. Ethan and Xana come back home early, spot Bonnie and Clyde in the home, and wondered why they were there. Think about it. Dot's claim seem more and more legitimate here. Dylan's whereabouts were not accounted for, which opens the door of her potentially being involved in the murders. The DoorDash driver was not identified, but the private driver was. The DoorDash driver was Bonnie. One is a so-called surviving housemate who nobody knows where she was before the murders, and a so-called DoorDash driver who pretended to deliver food to one of the victims. I don't know about anyone else, but we aren't going to bite our tongues here. Dylan's whereabouts were not accounted for because she was with Bonnie and Clyde at the home. Yes, at the home. She pretended to go out, but came back to the home. Bonnie and Clyde had called her regarding those housemates and their locations, etc. I bet $1 octillion that if they had searched Dylan's phone, they would see text messages and phone calls from Bonnie and Clyde. But even if you're protecting Dylan, you could still come up with an actual alibi, right? Out on the town was the best they could come up with? Where exactly out on the town? When you asked Dylan where she was and she told you out on the town, you didn't feel the need to get an actual location? Oh, that's good enough. No need to specify where exactly out on the town. It could be out on the back porch discussing the plan with Bonnie and Clyde. I mean, yeah, why not? Dot saw them in that very spot later that morning. Dylan never left the home because she had to stay there to set everything up with the perpetrators. We had a growing feeling she was involved with the murders even more so, when her whereabouts were not accounted for. We knew then that Dylan had been involved. It doesn't mean she did any physical harm to her housemates, and we can suggest she was told what to do. But regardless of the circumstances, Dylan was involved in the plan to murder those housemates. As for Bethany, the only thing that we focus on is the defense claims she has exculpatory evidence. She was willing to testify, so this indicates she either was ready to snitch in being a part of it, or she was willing to snitch on those who were a part of it. And this would be a dreadful nightmare for the prosecution because Dylan would end up being exposed eventually in that testimony, which leads to Kohberger being exonerated based on the evidence presented in her testimony. Now, if we broke this down, you better believe Bethany's attorney, the prosecution, the FBI, Moscow PD, and all who are covering it up wouldn't dare let Bethany testify. Judge gabbles down, preliminary hearing shut down, Bethany isn't allowed to testify, and for Dylan, she dodged the deadliest bullet ever known to mankind. Now let's try to figure out what Bethany's exculpatory evidence is. There has been speculation that Bethany saw a naked man running outside. Not sure where that is coming from because it's not in her affidavit and definitely not from a testimony. So if it's not from those sources, before someone says, oh, that was in her affidavit, don't get lost in the fuckery. There is no proof of her affidavit released. That shows that. These are rags, regurgitating rumors and theories in threads. Ironically, debunk rumors and theories that go against Kohberger being the killer in those same threads. Some rag called The Mirror claims that Bethany saw a naked man running out of the sliding doors. Quote, according to the affidavit, she allegedly witnessed a naked man run through a rear sliding door. She lived on the first floor of the home and came face to face with the alleged killer, unquote. Now, how in the flying fuck did Bethany see the naked man run through the rear sliding doors, which are on the second floor if she was on the first floor? For her to see this, she would have to be outside. It says, according to the affidavit, that is false. That's to convince the reader that the claim is backed by an official police report. It says she literally saw the naked man run through the rear sliding doors. Yes, through the sliding doors. The only way she could see this would be if she was standing outside the home, in the driveway. I mean, this is fucktardation. And they had the audacity to claim it was according to an affidavit. This was to actually justify Dylan's affidavit, making it appear they both saw the same Kohberger. But Dylan would have seen the naked man, right? Wasn't he clad in black clothing on his way out the door? And the alleged Kohberger wasn't parked in front of the house, so he would head the opposite direction of Bethany's view to the back of the house, around to Queen Road parking. This is ridiculous, but not surprising. It is alluding to Kohberger dumping the alleged jumpsuit in his, quote, kill kit, then running outside naked for everyone to see him, and hauling ass out of town in his light bulb. Think about it. It doesn't add up. I would suggest that the exculpatory evidence is centered around the time frame Ethan and Xana came home around 12 a.m. They were at the party for a few hours. Bethany was there. They decided to head back home. Get home, and to their surprise, Dylan is at home with Bonnie and Clyde there, and everything kind of went downhill from there. Someone notified Bethany at the party that there was a bit of trouble at home. She came back, and that's where the exculpatory evidence is coming from. It's only something she would know coming back to the home, as Dylan was already there, and her affidavit obviously presented a specific timeline that would be contradicted based on Bethany's accounts. Remember that exculpatory evidence would exonerate Kohberger from the murder charges. And witnessing Bonnie and Clyde at the home, causing trouble with Ethan and Xana, it's something she saw personally. The reason the defense obviously didn't call on Dylan is because she had already given a description of Kohberger. They sought out Bethany because somewhere, at some point, either her or somebody else had spoke out about Bethany knowing something, such as the communication to her while she was at the party. She came back home, and everything she saw and heard during that 1 a.m. to 2:20 a.m. time frame is the evidence that the defense wanted her to testify in court about.
I want to add a few things here. Remember, Moscow PD had obtained that Linda Lane surveillance very early on. In fact, most didn't even know which surveillance they had. Now, if we examined that audio and revealed all of that evidence, Moscow PD definitely knew, meaning they heard the same name, Ethan, being heard, linked to a physical altercation. Just wanted to wake you up a bit. Here's another one. I want to address the Pi-Fi issue again. We claimed that Dylan was not a Pi-Fi in previous episodes. Many claimed she was one. We researched it, and it appeared she was a Pi-Fi. But once again, the information seems to always get confusing. If anyone remembers our episodes regarding this, we pointed out that in an article, it doesn't have Dylan as a Pi-Fi, but it had Bethany as a Pi-Fi, along with her sisters in the house. If Dylan was a Pi-Fi, why did they report that only Bethany was one? I'll wait for something rational to come to everyone's brain. Well, time's up. Dylan wasn't a Pi-Fi. She may have been associated with them, but she wasn't actually a Pi-Fi. We're not very privy to the Greek life, but I would assume if she was an actual Pi-Fi sister, that report wouldn't only have Bethany as one. You're looking at it, right smack dab on the screen. But you may need it recited back to you to really grasp it. Quote, both Mortensen and Funk were roommates of the 3 slain girls, and Funk was in the same sorority, Pi Beta Phi, as Kernodal and Mogan. We used this same segment of the article in that episode and highlighted the key terms. The term Anne is distinguishing a difference between Dylan and Bethany here. You understand? Dylan and Bethany were roommates of the 3 slain girls, and they both were in the same sorority, Pi Beta Phi. It does not say this, which means Dylan was not, I repeat, was not a Pi Phi. I mean, doesn't this seem strange to everyone? Going all the way back to where it started, with the WSU Kim claims, we broke down that the individual who had notified other sisters was, of course, Bethany, because she was reported as being a Pi Phi, and Dylan wasn't. This is all linked to what has been broken down thus far in the episode, my friends. It was Bethany who had called other sisters about the incident, but it's possible she had left the home after notifying them. She had witnessed what she witnessed, didn't want to stick around in that house with dead housemates, and got the hell out of there. Yeah, could have called the authorities, but Greek life does not do this. They call fellow Greek members, and they handle the problems. Dylan, on the other hand, had no choice but to stick around, because she was a part of the conspiracy to murder those housemates, either it be voluntarily or involuntarily. It was Bethany who was the actual witness, not Dylan, because Dylan was one of the conspirators. And that likelihood to betray your housemates may come from the fact that she wasn't really a sister. We broke this down, of course. Since she was not a real sister, Dylan couldn't really be trusted, from the outside looking in. Oh, but there's tons of photos of her with Pi-Fi t-shirts on. She's at all the events. Well, tell that to the person who wrote the article. That doesn't have her as a Pi-Fi sister, along with Bethany, Xana, and Madison. I suspect that Bethany left within the wee hours of the night and never came back. We all wondered why Bethany didn't have anything significant in her affidavit. It's because what she knew, they didn't want to publicly tell everyone. Obviously, it would conflict with what Dylan so-called stated. Do you see the flip-flop? The actual witness, meaning the person who was innocent, her accounts were quashed, just like her testimony. But the conspirator, oh, she has so much information to provide the public about that night. Bethany got the hell out of there after those murders, but they injected her in every setting at the home after she was already gone. They claim she was there the following morning when the housemates, quote, discovered their peers unconscious. They even claimed she was texting Dylan during the murders. Bethany may have texted Dylan. Yeah, after she was down the road, called whoever to come pick her up, and got as far away from there as possible. Later that morning, Bethany was back in her hometown of Nevada. Dylan was left to deal with the problems she contributed to. That's karma for you, right? I mean, as a friend, would you leave the house if you knew that one of your housemates had something to do with the other housemates being murdered? I'm thinking, for your safety first, you would definitely leave. Because if Dylan was a part of conspiring against those housemates, it's possible she would attempt to have Bethany harmed that same night. I want you all to examine a few photos of Dylan and Bethany. I don't think it's just me, but it looks like Bethany does not really embrace Dylan. But with Xana and Maddie, her actual Pi-Fi sisters, she has a genuine smile and happiness. With Dylan, it's like she's forced to carry out the sham of Dylan being a Pi-Fi. We even suggested that the only reason she was living in that house is because she offered some sort of financial assistance and perhaps brought the very drug element into the home that ended up costing those housemates their lives. And Bethany definitely would get away from her after that. If we were to get a testimony from her, she would air Dylan out big time. Quote, she wasn't a sister. She was trying to bribe her way into being a Pi-Fi. She fucking started trouble in the house and made things dangerous for us. After she moved in, All types of strange and suspicious people started coming over. I felt like she was making things dangerous for the household, and she didn't seem to care about what everyone else thought. I never trusted her, but I tried to be nice and give her the benefit of the doubt. Unquote. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, but there's only one word to describe Bethany's look: disgusted. I know it seems a bit cruel to say this about Dylan, but she clearly was involved. Bethany has the exculpatory evidence, which includes Dylan's involvement in the murders. We're pretty good on reading people's body language, and from the jump, we assumed Bethany was the soft-spoken housemate who was a bit more down to earth. And we never viewed any of their TikTok content, neither. It was based off the photos released. We depicted Dylan as the troublemaker in the house based on the photos released. It was her demeanor. I want to be the cool chick, I want to be the center of attention, and was jealous of others who had more popularity. Yep, that's a motive right there. So a growing dislike for your housemates gives you the drive to go with a plan to harm the one you're jealous of.
Well, that pretty much solved the case, right? Anyone familiar with the chaos? There's no room for censoring anything. People's lives have been taken, and if someone or a group of individuals may be involved and the evidence starts to build up against them, there's no room for censoring anything. In our analysis, we came to the logical conclusion that Dylan was the key connection to the drug trafficking element from that house. Again, Dot claims to have spotted Dylan, Bonnie and Clyde, and 2 other males outside the home that morning. Bonnie and Clyde were physically in that home that night, and Ethan and Xana had come back and found it suspicious. Xana calls her dad, telling him there were drug dealers in the home and felt there may have been danger. The father advises her and Ethan to just mind their business and lock their bedroom door. Remember, he had visited the home to fix the lock on her bedroom door. Soon after, Bonnie and Clyde tell Dylan they may be a problem. She knocks on the door, an argument ensues, Clyde and Ethan get into it and go outside and fight. Ethan loses the fight, Xana is held back by Bonnie, and, we can't know how that panned out in how they physically were found deceased in the home. But the fact that Bonnie pretended to be the DoorDash driver for Xana specifically, there may have been an altercation between these two prior, such as when Ethan and Xana came home early around 12 a.m. What do you guys think? Because for Bonnie to so-called deliver DoorDash to Xana, when we obviously know she hadn't ordered anything, why would Bonnie specifically choose Xana out of all the housemates to pretend to deliver to? Once again, Xana never ordered Jack in a crack that night because the crack employee described Bonnie as the DoorDash driver and had ordered and delivered it. So we know Xana never ordered the crack. Xana and Bonnie get into it, and Bonnie chose to pretend to deliver the crack to Xana, well, because she was someone who didn't approve of them being in the house. Bonnie knew those housemates, or at least knew some, and was known by others. And with all due respect to Xana's mother, maybe Bonnie and Clyde were associated with her, and this is why Xana despised them. So of course, she would definitely have a problem with them being at the home that night, because from her view, they are the very scum that contributed to her mother's drug addiction and problems. Regardless of a drug addiction, mother and daughter loved each other, but of course a lot of anger and resentment existed. Mind you, we have to keep stressing this. Students had confirmed that Bonnie and Clyde were the major pushers in town. Xana didn't like them. Ethan, of course, will defend Xana's resentment towards them, and that led to a fight against Clyde. In the other audio from the actual neighbor's camera, we hear a black male, and this would be Clyde, based on all the information and evidence presented. The biggest reason we know this black male is Clyde is because we know it was Bonnie who delivered the crack. Another male was heard in that audio saying, quote, "Do we have a problem here?" As if to say, who is causing problems for us, who need to be dealt with. A male is heard, which he states, quote, "Emma, get over here." He would be on the phone with her. Ah, it's all adding up. Bonnie had left some time prior when the goons came to murder those housemates, or was there when it happened, then rushed to the crack. The neighbor calls Bonnie because he already knew she was involved. She arrives later, of course, as the so-called DoorDasher. Of course, the mainstream media claimed the audio was fake, performing, you guessed it, damage control. If we put all of this together, we have a solid timeline of events. Ethan and Xana had left the party around 12 a.m., and in this scenario, Bethany seeing them at the party makes more sense. You see, they're hiding the truth and the timeline of events. Came back home only to find Dylan with Bonnie and Clyde, perhaps hanging out in the living room. Mind you, The living room is next to Xana's bedroom as well. Xana calls her father about these drug pushers in the house. They are advised to just go in the bedroom and stay out of whatever business that Dylan had with the pushers. Some time may have passed before anything happened. Perhaps in relation to Maddie and Kaylee, with Jack's warning, maybe Jack was warning the girls about Bonnie and Clyde, right? And they were both there talking to Dylan, instructing her to set up her housemates. And Ethan and Xana come home earlier than Dylan expected, and well, things got a bit suspicious. Perhaps after 30 minutes or so, a dispute ensues. Xana may have gotten into it with Bonnie. Clyde tries to threaten her, Ethan steps in, and they end up going outside to fight. Ethan is defending not only his girlfriend, but also he is defending the safety of the home as well. Since Bonnie and Clyde would be, quote, feared in the neighborhood, everyone would just observe what happened without informing the authorities. Although they're not the biggest fish, they are connected to the bigger fish, so people know not to play with them. But if you're put in a position to defend your girl, you do it. And this may explain what sounded like someone being thrown against a car. Ethan allowed himself to be beaten to let Clyde establish so-called dominance and control, as he's the drug pusher in town. But to Ethan, he had to defend his girlfriend, even if meant possibly being murdered. At 2:20 a.m., all of this physical activity was heard. Kaylee and Maddie had been calling Jack from 2:30 a.m. to close to 3 a.m. From 2:20 a.m. to the first call from the girls around 2:30 a.m., we can suggest that Kaylee and Maddie called based on this fight. Ethan is either carried back to the home already deceased or left outside on the ground unconscious. Now, in that episode examining the Linda Lane audio, we presented the possibility that the individuals spotted running in the body cam footage had dropped Ethan's body off back inside the home. The path of where they came from was either the Queen Road apartments or the victim's home. Well, it could have been both, of course. After Ethan was either severely beaten or even deceased, they carried his body back to the home. Xana may have fought and was murdered as well. And then those individuals then run away from the home. They are spotted at 3:12 a.m. At this time, perhaps all of the housemates were already murdered. Of course, there was speculation that a female's scream was heard. Some claimed it was a tire screeching, but even if it were a tire screeching, guess what? That vehicle is obviously screeching. Its tires speeding off right around the time the murders were approximately taking place. So it doesn't matter which one. That general time frame of 3:12 a.m. is when those housemates were either already deceased or were in the process of being murdered. Mind you, Ethan and Xana were home before Kaylee and Maddie in the 12 a.m. time frame. Ethan's body is carried back to the home, placed in the hallway, and Kaylee and Maddie call Jack around this same time frame. I think there were two separate attacks, linked to the same motive, if you understand. Kaylee and Maddie were attacked based on their own consequences, but they also find out that Ethan and Xana were dealt with. They called Jack, but the person in the home who was involved, based on a connection to Bonnie and Clyde, notified them that Kaylee and Maddie were calling someone about. From Dylan's view, she wouldn't know if they were calling 911, so she notified Bonnie and Clyde that they may be calling the authorities. Then you have the claims that Ethan had been beaten because he was involved in dumping drugs, which were valued in the hundreds of thousands. I do believe someone in that house had decided to turn away from the drug activity, didn't want to be a part of it, or didn't want to be a part of it anymore. Maddie is plastered, just telling Adam whatever she told him, and Jack warned the girls about that. And that led to a break in trust, which obviously could lead to someone snitching. I think they agreed to let drugs be trafficked in the house, and that was their business arrangement with Bonnie and Clyde. Maybe a housemate was actually selling drugs out of the house. Who knows? But I think the household was used as a trap house. Maybe Ethan wasn't too fond of the idea that his girlfriend could potentially get caught up, and one night just decided to dump drugs that were stashed in the closet or something. Everyone freaks out, and of course, well, the consequences were fatal. The thing is, Kaylee and Maddie were already being hunted. Bonnie and Clyde and other goons came back to finish Kaylee and Maddie. Bonnie, though, came back later to see if everything had, quote, been kept a secret within the neighborhood. No cops were present, no flashing lights. She knew nobody had called the authorities, and used the DoorDash delivery as a way to come back to observe everything in the neighborhood and within the house physically. But somebody had to inform the authorities because based on our examination and others who examined this theory, it was the unmarked cruiser who was circling Queen Road Apartments during the time frame of 3:30 a.m. to 4:07 a.m. Perhaps it was Bonnie and Clyde letting the unmarked cruiser know. They would be obviously corrupt cops who had been in communication with Bonnie and Clyde. Remember, the DoorDash driver was not identified in the PCA, so they protected that identity, so it makes sense that Bonnie and Clyde had a few puppets within that department. The same unmarked cruiser comes back to inspect the situation. Perhaps one of them goes to the home to check the crime scene out.
It's okay. I'm here to help you.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm here to help you cover this up. Move Ethan's body from the hallway to the bed, making it look like he was murdered while asleep. Create a story, timeline of events which align with Bonnie's DoorDash. So the initial time frame of some, quote, activity was placed in the 4 a.m. time frame. You see? Okay, we can continue to break this down, but let's let this set in for a moment. Because it's clear Bonnie and Clyde were involved. But based on the 12 a.m. arrival back home by Ethan and Xana, it's likely they were targeted because they came in on the actual plan between Dylan, Bonnie, and Clyde. May have not overheard anything, but knew that their presence in the home indicated danger. Who knows? Ethan and Xana may have been aware of the same danger Jack warned Kaylee and Maddie about. Since the girls were obviously in danger, I'm sure Ethan and Xana knew about it as well. And if the danger is coming from Bonnie and Clyde, coming home at 12 a.m. and seeing them inside the home with Dylan, shit, they're not there to have a few drinks. Dylan, Bonnie, and Clyde in the home that night, then Dylan, Bonnie, and Clyde standing outside the home later that morning. And the other two males? Well, what if it was both Jacks? Kaylee could have called her ex-boyfriend, while Maddie had called the other Jack, who was best friends with her boyfriend. That seems logical. One of them was described as a pale male with light-colored hair by Dot. That would be the ex-boyfriend in my opinion. Then the male with his head down wearing a hoodie? That would be the Jack that warned the girls earlier. It all adds up as a solid theory to who was directly involved. This is the chaos sector.